Wish We Could Turn Back Time by Girlinpink44. Chapter 10, Making Up for Lost Time. Before I start, guys, I want you to know that I am actually in Disneyland Paris as I am recording this. This chapter takes place in Disney World, California in Florida. I've actually been there as a child, I think, but I don't remember much, and I've been saving up for this trip for literally over a year, so I wanted you all to know that I am actually wearing my silver sequin and gold bow Minnie Mouse ears as I record this. So I hope my joy about my trip translates into my reading. So let's have a look, shall we? Tony had either made the best or worst decision of his life. At the moment, he wasn't sure which way this day was going to go. He was sitting in the back seat between two boys who were talking a mile a minute. Rhodey and Happy were in the front seat while the others were in a car behind them. How he had managed to agree to sit behind two children who were on their way to Disneyland was beyond him. What he did for his kids. At the same time, he was just as excited as they were. Morgan had loved going to Disney World, and he had found out that the boys hadn't been to a theme park like that. And what better way to spend a day of spring break when in California? This week was for resting, for recharging his batteries, for recovering from what he had endured. To the world, he had been in that cave this time a week ago. To him, he had died mere days ago. Peter and Harley had been dead mere days ago. So, if he drove himself insane while riding rides at Disneyland to keep his kids happy, it was time well spent. In a couple of years, they'd have to head to Universal Orlando when Hogsmeade opened. He knew Peter would drool over that. But for now, the boys were waving two different guidebooks at each other and comparing their lists of rides they need to go on, treats they want to eat, characters they wanted to attempt to encounter, and more. Finally, they started seeing signs for the resort, and they entered the property. Tony hadn't believed it was possible, but the two boys had gotten even more excited. It took a bit for the group to find parking spaces, a few minutes more for them to find Ben, May, and Pepper. Finally, they got to the monorail and rode it to the entrance of Magic Kingdom. Tickets secured, Tony got the crew through the gate when Peter and Harley stopped cold. Standing not too far away from the entryway, Mickey and Minnie stood happily greeting guests and taking pictures. At the moment, Harley and Peter were acting more their external age instead of their mental age, because both boys had the same shocked expression. They then looked at each other and grabbed Tony's hands, pulling him towards the infamous mice. "Come on, Dad! Get a move on, mechanic!" Tony looked at the other adults who were following behind and shrugged his shoulders, and let himself get pulled to the line of kids with their parents. They waited, the boys continuing their discussion, Ben taking pictures with a camera Tony recognized from the future. And everyone talking. Luckily, outside of business circles, Tony's fame wasn't as big as it would have been after he uttered the words "I am Iron Man," so he hoped that he could stay incognito. He was in a casual outfit, a baseball cap and sunglasses. While he couldn't and wouldn't hide the signature goatee, he hoped people would overlook it so he could enjoy his day with his boys. They didn't have to wait too long, surprisingly, though the line was getting longer behind them. Finally, they made it up, and Harley bounded over and gave them both a hug. Peter's shy side came out, and Tony gave him a gentle shove towards them, and Peter went over. His hug was softer, and he wore a big grin. The people inside the suits did a wonderful job of being excited for the pair of boys, and after a second, Ben and Tony got shots of the boys alone and together with the infamous couple. "Dad, you've got to take one too! Everyone, get in!" Ben handed his camera to one of the handlers, and everyone got in and arranged themselves together. After a quick photo, they let the next person have their turn. They officially made their way onto Main Street, USA, and could easily see Sleeping Beauty Castle ahead. The boys were bouncing, talking to each other, themselves, Tony, the other adults, are not always making sense. But their excitement was infectious, and the group made their way to Tomorrowland. By 1 inch, Peter, the shortest of the two boys, to his disgruntlement, was tall enough to ride Space Mountain. The boys let out a triumphant cheer, and everyone found themselves in the queue. The boys commented over the way it was decorated, enjoying every bit of the experience. Peppa, out of an abundance of caution, decided to find a seat nearby and wait for them. It was still early in the day, so their wait wasn't too long for the infamous ride. Soon enough, the group was splitting up and getting into positions for the roller coaster. It would take 3 cars to get their entire group on the ride. Tony rode with the boys, taking the back seat in the front car while they rock, paper, scissored from the front seat. Peter won and triumphantly sat down with Harley not too far behind. A few minutes later, the boys were giggling and begging to ride again. This time, May and Ben decided to join Peppa as the 5 went and got back in line. The wait was slightly longer as the park was starting to fill up as the spring break crowd rushed to the popular ride. Harley was in the front seat, and after a second time, Tony talked the boys into other rides. Stitch was out and about, and the boys got pictures with the infamous alien. They made quick work of the rest of Tomorrowland before circling the park. While it was fairly crowded, Tony had paid to make sure they could get fast passes on rides to make sure the boys did as much as they could. And they ate it up. Tony watched Peter especially as he ran around the park, acting more like the age he appeared than the age he was inside. He was fully aware that the kid was taking advantage of that fact, and Tony was loving every second of it. When he had met Peter, back in the so-called Civil War, the kid had already been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Very rarely would even Tony get to see him as light and as carefree as he was running around Tom Sawyer's Island, climbing things and playing. Tony didn't bother to hide the sappy grin that he knew was on his face. Peppa came beside him, putting her arm around him. This is what we're working towards. More days like this.
This may be one of my favourite days.
He watched his 2 kids run around playing pirate. Mine too. May came up on his other side. Ben was off getting pictures of the boys from a different angle. Tony had realised that the familiar camera was Ben's, and it was something Peter enjoyed using after the man's death. Perhaps it was a way he had kept Ben close. It's been quite a while since I've seen Peter just be a kid.
He has a second chance, and this time, I want him to hold on to it as long as possible.
Tony smiled. Tony was bone dead tired. He had been dragged from one end of Magic Kingdom to the other and back again. They'd had snacks, Peter's metabolism had certainly picked up in the last few days, and the adults were carrying around trinkets. At this point, the only item left on their plate was the fireworks show, and they had found the best spot and were settling in for the show. Harley was standing next to him, but Peter had ended up in his arms. Thanks for bringing us, Dad.
Of course, Bambino. Did you have fun?
It was the best. The lights dimmed and the music started. Julie Andrews came on and talked before the voice of a young girl sang. Starlight, star bright, first star I see tonight. I wish I may, I wish I might, have the wish I wish tonight. We'll make a wish and do what dreamers do, and all our wishes will come true. As the show continued, he looked at both of his boys, who were completely mesmerized by the spectacular show. The term dreamer had been used in regards to him. Visionary was more common. But sitting on the porch, overlooking the lake, or even at Disney World a couple of years ago, he had dreamed of a day where he could share a moment like this with Peter and Harley again. He had made a wish, and the stones had made it come true. And he was so grateful. He had a choice to make it right, to fix everything that had gone wrong. There was the chance to watch his boys grow up, to make sure that he was there for his friends in a way that he wasn't before. Sure, there were insane times ahead. But as the music shifted to feature the attractions they had ridden throughout the day, Tony could let the tension slip away. For now, he had his family. There were fireworks. Maybe it was time to do what dreamers do. After all, several of his wishes had come true. In the original timeline, it had taken Tony a few weeks to build the Mark II suit. There had been a lot of trial and error as he worked to tweak a design he had made from scraps in a cave. But he had done it bit by bit, with dozens upon dozens of tests to make sure the pieces worked the way they were supposed to. This time he didn't have to go through all that trial and error. He knew the basic functions of the Iron Man suit by hand. And this time he wasn't hiding it from everyone. "It's the suit!"
Rue, you've worked on the suit before.
"But not the Mark II, and not in your original lab."
"Even though I didn't get to see this, I met you the day you got it blown up."
He looked at the two boys who were looking at the specs on a hollow screen. A gauntlet and boot sat on a nearby table where Tony was tweaking the design when sleep evaded him. All in all, he was much further along than he had been at this point. "So what are you going to add to it? Your later suits could do so many things." Peter's eyes were wide. "I once again humbly submit my earlier suggestion. Stealth mode." "Like the shield helicarriers? That would be so cool, Dad!" That launched the two boys into a mile-a-minute discussion, which bled over to a second hollow table, where they had a second set of specs up. Tony was content to let this pair sit back and talk through the ideas. It would help him gauge where they were and how he could challenge them. With only 2 days left in their spring break, Tony was trying to come up with ideas for the boys when he couldn't be close. Harley would end up with a kid-friendly setup as he had before in the shed. The trick would be finding things Harley hadn't learned while getting him to brush up on stuff he already knew. Peter, on the other hand, was a sponge. He was as academic as he was hands-on, unlike Harley and Tony. Sometimes just throwing him books and articles and journals would be enough, but he wanted to throw in some fun projects on his way. But for now, with the clouds heavy over the mansion, tempting a second rainy day, you know what they say about April showers. This week, he could bring the boys downstairs and let them tinker. "The biggest problem will be the thrusters. The helicarriers use engines and turbines, so those are easier to mask." Peter pointed at one of the gauntlets on the screen.
"The biggest place is visible right at the hands and feet, so we need to figure a way to either cut down on the light without decreasing mechanics' energy output, or come up with something to compensate."
The two continued to bicker and brainstorm, bouncing off of each other the way he and Rhodey did in college. Maybe he should coax his friend into the lab more often this time around. People forgot that War Machine went to MIT too and graduated with honours as well. He just got dwarfed in the light of Tony Stark, which is something Tony should make sure happens less and less. His friend should have been there in the Battle of New York. He should have included him more. He should have protected him in Germany. While the child geniuses continued to bicker, Tony went back to the original hollow screen and began adjusting things he had planned. Some hidden weaponry, more allowances for potential damage, and backups for him inside. Siberia couldn't happen again. He wanted it to look sleeker than the original Mark II, but not so mind-blowing that it was a stretch for someone like him to create. Then again, he was going to blow minds with his tech. Tony almost felt sorry for Microsoft and Apple for what was to come. The problem was they had become so stagnant and would remain so even in the face of Stark Industries taking the world by storm. When had they last done anything innovative and changed up their technology? When they had come to a point where they relied on brand loyalty. Right now there were two names on the market, Android and Apple. Tony was months away from adding a third, Stark. and they'd take the world by storm. He needed to consult R&D about making sure they had laptops that worked for gamers and coders, as there were already plenty of MMOs out there. He had sat through enough of Peter's ramblings to know about some of them, and game developers were only going to go up from there. He'd add creating the beginnings of the operating system to his list after the boys went home. It gives him something to do when he can't wander into another room and seek comfort from them. Making sure he added an allowance for flares and for EMP grenades he had created, hoping to unsettle some of Hydra's tech. He'd start small, but with Nebula's help, he had gotten some energy readings off of alien tech, and he hoped that by the time it came to face Thanos, that might be another tool in his arsenal. He hadn't quite cracked it yet in the years between snaps. But he'd also been missing his favourite lab assistants, who had added notepads to their holoscreen project and were drawing diagrams and bickering some more. It was a sight to see.
"Sir,"
Tony grinned at the sight of Jarvis's voice. If there was something that came in third to having his boys back, it was having Jarvis back. He had yet to grow tired of talking to his old friend, sometimes coming down to the lab after the rest of the house's occupants were asleep, just to chat.
"Yeah, Joe? Mrs. Potts has asked me to tell you and the boys that supper is almost ready, and that you should wash up before drastic measures are taken."
"You do it, Jarvis. Time to bag it up." Tony grinned at the groans from the boys.
"We'll come back down before I take you two home. Don't worry."
It was the last day before Harley and Peter would head home, and Tony had wanted to make it perfect. The weather had behaved, and now they were on his private beach where they had spent the day. Rhodey and Happy had brought the grill down and were working on a feast for dinner. Ben stood nearby, beer in hand, arguing with them. While it had taken most of the week, Ben was doing his best to fit in as the only one in their group who didn't remember the years that never were, and they were making sure he felt accepted. May and Pepper were lounging in chairs nearby, an umbrella providing them with shade as they read different books and talked. That was a team-up that still terrified him to this day. Down by the water, the boys were running around in the waves. Sometimes they were swimming, sometimes they were playing tag, and, if the multiple sand structures were anything to go by, building castles. At the moment, they seemed content to just run through the waves. Tony watched the screen, feeling a lot lighter than he had expected for a location with a few of his triggers. But as long as he focused on who he was with, he was able to shove some of that down. He was sipping on a root beer, even in a glass bottle that seemed to thrill the kids so much, make them feel adult. He was trying to calm his nerves. Not from the setting like everyone around him thought, but because of what was in the pocket of his swim trunks. Pepper's ring. He'd already bought it in this timeline, on a whim, knowing that he was in love with her, but too full of self-loathing to pop the question, or ask her on a date even. It would take the noble and surprising deed of a spiderling to finally get this ring delivered to the woman it belonged to. But that was one thing that would change. He was asking her now. Tonight. The sun was setting. It was so cliché to be on a beach, but after springing the question on her at a press conference, he wanted something simpler and quieter. "Penny for your thoughts?" He turned to see Pepper walking towards him, smiling. "You seem to be lost in them more than usual." Could he do this? He'd done it before. Married, kids, the whole thing. He'd even retired, but it hadn't exactly stuck. "Tony, what is it?"
"All of this. It's so big. And we're all here. The boys, Ben and May, Happy and Rhodey, you and me. It's so familiar and so different."
"That's true."
"And there's one major difference between then and now that I want to fix as soon as possible."
Pepper turned to him. "What's that?" Deciding to take the plunge, He grabbed the box out of his pocket and went down on one knee.
Marry me. Again. I can't promise I'll manage to retire again. I can't promise that I won't be a self-sacrificial idiot. But I can promise you that I'm a better version of myself when you're by my side. It took me far too long last time around to ask you this question, and I want to make it up for lost time by asking you again now. Virginia Pepper Potts, would you marry me?
Yes, absolutely yes. She smiled at him, tears in her eyes. He got up and slipped the familiar ring back onto her finger where it belonged. And then he swung her into his arms and kissed her. Not too far away, the sound of cheering broke out as he broke the kiss. He barely caught the sight of the two tornadoes running towards them before he had a kid latched onto both legs. Tony shook his head and coaxed them off as they made their way over to the grill, where congratulations were exchanged. Both boys talking a mile a minute about being able to be at the wedding this time. Peppa asked a maid to be her matron of honour, which earned her a tearful nod. There was a lot to do, but at this moment, Tony was perhaps the happiest man alive. End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that one. Oh, I've been wanting to do that one for over a year now, and I get to do it in Disneyland Paris. Oh my god, guys, I cannot tell you how joyful I am to be here. As you know, I am on the autistic spectrum, and many people who are like me tend to have a hyperfixation. Mine is stories in general. History, fantasy, mythology. You know, I have a wide range. But Disney is what started it, kicked in the butt by Harry Potter and amplified by the Greek mythology. And to be able to be in Disneyland, to wear beautiful dresses and tiaras in public and get approval for it, that's amazing. But just the feeling of being here, guys. Oh, I am going to remember this trip for as long as I possibly can. And with my memory, that's going to be a long time. Not to brag. But it's amazing. I actually hugged Mickey Mouse today, got his autograph, and he kissed it. I mean, I'm happy right now. I'm so happy. And I hope you guys are happy too. Remember to have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Bye, my guys, gals, and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video, okay? Take care. I love you all. Bye.